Welcome to this a special lecture held by ISCS, and we are going to have a special lecture on boredom today. My name is Cathy Zhang. The Chinese name is Zhang Jing. I work at the School of Chinese Studies and Cultural Exchange at Renmin University of China. I'm also one of the editors for the study of Christian culture, the Journal for the Study of Christian Culture published by Renmin University of China. This journal has an international version and which is working with ISCS. So I have been working very closely with ISCS for many years, and I'm very honored to be the host for today's lecture. Today we're going to have Professor Nicholas Lombardo. We're going to see his face very soon. Professor Nicholas Lombardo is an associate professor from the Catholic University of America. He received his PhD from the University of Cambridge in 2010 and spent time as a visiting fellow at the University of Freiburg, Durham University, and also taught as a visiting professor at the Peking University as well as Chinese University of Hong Kong. He has published many articles and books, and some of them are Boredom and Modern Culture, published in Logos, a journal for the Catholic thought and culture. That's going to be the basic article of his lecture today. And his other publications include Evil, Suffering, and Original Sin. And also he has a book he's going to introduce in his lectures today. And we are going to have 1 hour lecture, and then I'm going to give a very brief response, about 5 to 10 minutes. Then we're going to have 20 to 30 minutes question and answers. I'm told by the ISCS colleagues at ISCS that the point of Professor Lombardo's lecture today has been uploaded to Baidu Yunpan. And actually, if you click the 问答, and you will see the link, so you can download your point there now or later. And actually, Professor Lombardo is going to share the screen, and so you will see the point from the screen. In case there is any technical problem that this conference was all of a sudden turned off, don't worry and don't be nervous. You can come back with the same code and a password or the same number back to the conference again. We will do that again anyway. We just pray that this will not happen. Now I'm going to leave the time for Professor Lombardo. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Zhang. It's truly a joy and an honor to be connected with you. I'm on the other side of the world in Washington, D.C. I'm also speaking from your past because I'm 12 hours behind you. It's evening here. I know it's morning there. And so it's a real pleasure to be with you. I've been visiting China now for over 13 years. I first came to visit friends in 2008. I thought it'd be my only visit, but I've been coming back many times over the years, and it's a pleasure to be joining you now by video. So the topic that I'm going to be speaking about today is boredom. So usually by its nature, something that people try to avoid, but I can see you're not trying to avoid it. You're here with me. And I think you will find, I hope you will find that boredom, the topic of boredom, wu liao, if I'm saying that right in Chinese, is actually a very interesting topic because it's so much a part of our lives and it's so much a part of our culture, both in the West and I know in China as well from talking with Chinese friends. So give me a moment here. Okay, so one of the ways in which boredom it manifests itself in terms of at least I'm speaking mainly from a Western perspective in this talk, is especially in literature. Literature is a place where boredom is talked about quite a bit. So I want to begin with a book, probably the first major work of European literature that tackles boredom as its main theme. And it's a kind of a strange book. It's called Against the Grain, sometimes à rebours in French, also translated as Against Nature. And it's a strange book. The author, J.K. Huysmans, wrote it in the 1880s, and he didn't expect many people to read it. He thought maybe 10 people would read it, and very few people would understand it or care. And he had a good reason to expect that, because it's a book about nothing. And yet, in fact, his book was a huge hit. It was something that people were reading throughout Europe, not just in France. Now, there were many people who loved it, but there are other people who were outraged by it because they thought it was challenging a lot of cultural and moral norms of the time. But here's the plot. The plot is simply that there's a rich nobleman who's in France, in Paris, who decides that he's kind of had enough of life, of modern city life, and he decides and after living a very hedonistic life, and he decides, I'm just going to go to the outskirts of Paris, live in a house, and just try to amuse myself and avoid boredom. And so the book, just chapter after chapter, is about seemingly boring things. So in one chapter, he just spends, it's all about how he decorates his room with different color schemes and tries different color schemes. In another chapter, he's mentally thinking about all the books in his library, just kind of going through them, listing them. Another time, he goes through and he's collecting different kinds of flowers. Another chapter, he's experimenting with perfumes and fragrances. All of the book is about him trying to avoid boredom, to try to somehow find things to interest himself. But at the end of it, after trying to distract himself with all these different pursuits, well, what I forgot, the most famous is he takes a turtle, a huge tortoise, and encrusts it with gold and jewels on the outside of its shell. And anyways, after all this, it doesn't work. And in order to escape, he has to go back to Paris. His health is shattered, and nothing happens in the book. There are no other characters in the book. But people found it really interesting. And myself, I read it, and strangely enough, it is kind of an interesting book, despite all the fact that he's doing these seemingly kind of strange things to avoid boredom. And what seems to be the case is that the reason why it was so popular and struck such a chord is simply because he was naming an experience that many people at the time were having in modern cities in Europe, that although they had all these different things at their disposal, new prosperity, new cultural events, new activities, people were finding it boring. They weren't engaged by it. And it seems that his contemporaries found it refreshing and even a kind of relief to read about somebody else who had the same experience of finding this modern city life somehow unsatisfying. And so the book itself was more, it was connecting with people. It was affirming that they weren't the only ones to feel this way. Now, today, a book like Against the Grain would not stand out, because in modern Western literature, you find many, many books that are about people dealing with feeling bored, feeling like their life has no purpose, their life has no meaning, the problems of city life. This is now very common, but in the late 1800s, Huysmans was one of the first to really tackle the issue. So now I want to shift here and move to talking about what, in philosophical terms, we could call the phenomenology of boredom. Phenomenology, as you may be familiar, is a philosophical movement that started around 1900 that focuses on phenomenon, how things appear to us in the world. Not trying to figure things out, in the first place, but just to reflect on what is our experience? How do we experience the world? How do we experience other people? How do we experience emotion? And so I want to start here using especially literature and philosophy as a reference point to just talk about the phenomenology of boredom. What is it like to be bored? What is boredom? Let's talk about it. Today, people are constantly talking about boredom or being bored. Most of the time when they talk about it, it's not in a serious way. Oh, I'm feeling very bored. Or, oh, that TV show is very boring. Or that person is very boring. But it's something that's just kind of thrown out without often it being reflected on. Isn't it interesting that we get bored? What exactly is boredom? And why do we not like being bored? What's going on? And so that's the main starting point, first of all, for today is to think about, it's interesting that we get bored. What's going on with boredom? Let's not take it for granted. Let's think about it. What is boredom? There's a wonderful line from an American writer, novelist, Walker Percy. He's from the American South. And he has a great line. He says this: why is it that no other species but man gets bored? Under the circumstances in which a man gets bored, a dog goes to sleep. Humans get bored. Dogs don't. Interesting. So what is boredom? What can we say about it? How can we describe what it's like to be bored? So the emotional state of boredom, it's a subtle thing. Like if you're angry, it's very obvious what it means to be angry. But how do you describe being bored? How would you describe it to somebody who's never been bored before? Well, on the one hand, being bored is unpleasant. It's not something that people like, but it's not like it's painful either. Like if you got a pain in your foot, that's painful. But when you're bored, it's not pleasant, but it's not painful like that. It's also, when you're bored, it's not like, when you feel sad, you might cry, for example. But when you're bored, you don't feel something so dramatic. It's not dramatic. It's not so obvious when you feel bored. But what we can say about when we're bored, it's like in all that we're doing or that we see, nothing engages us. It doesn't interest us. Or on some level, maybe we kind of somewhat find it interesting, but somehow we want to do something else. We're not interested in what we're doing or what we're experiencing. One American philosopher and literary critic calls boredom experience without qualities. Experience without qualities. And what she means by that is, it's like you're experiencing life, but there's nothing special about it. It's just kind of blah. And the interesting thing about boredom is that what bores you or what bores me might be very different things. For example, you could imagine someone who jumps out of planes a lot. Maybe it's their job. They instruct people on how to skydive and open parachutes. Maybe for them, it gets boring, even though I've never jumped out of a plane and I hope never to do so. But if I did, I would not find it boring. But there's something about being bored. It's not the experience itself necessarily. It's about how we experience it. It's an experience, and yet somehow it has no flavor to us. It's like food that it doesn't have flavor. It's not bad, it's not good. It's just no flavor. Leo Tolstoy, the great Russian novelist, in his novel Anna Karenina, calls boredom the desire for desires. And I really like this definition. I think this gets at something that boredom, a lot of it has to do with desire. We desire something, but it's not that we desire anything in particular. We wish we cared. We wish there was something we desired. So if you're watching a TV show or a movie and you're just like, I wish I cared about what I'm watching. but you don't. There's something, your desires don't connect. You wish you desired what you were watching, or you wish you cared, but you don't. Another, boredom in the past 20 years or so has started to become the subject of psychological analysis. So, professional psychologists, academic psychologists have been doing studies of boredom. And like philosophers and literary figures, they also struggle to describe what boredom is. It's just not an easy thing to describe or to put into words. But there was an important study that was done about 10 years ago, and the psychologist doing this study defined boredom in this way: the the negative experience of wanting but being unable to engage in satisfying activity. The experience of wanting but not being able to engage in an activity that you find satisfying. It's a definition very similar to Leo Tolstoy, who wrote in the late 1800s. It's kind of an interesting way in which, just as a side note, you can often find great insights in literature about the human condition that here we have this definition by professional, scientific psychologists who come to a conclusion which is very similar to what Leo Tolstoy did in a novel. But anyways, this idea of boredom is something to do with desire. Now, another thing about boredom is that it can be connected to feelings of disgust. That boredom can lead to feelings of disgust for like what bores us. Like, if you're, again, to go back to the example of a movie, you're just like, oh, I just don't want it anymore. I'm just tired of it. You want to kind of push it away. Or another way in which boredom can then lead to is weariness, tiredness. Like you're just so bored and you just kind of lay around. There's nothing you want to do. On the one hand, you wish you cared, you wish you wanted to do something, but you don't. And you kind of tired. You're tired, but you're not tired. This theme of disgust and nausea, another important literary figure and philosopher, the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. He started, before he wrote philosophy, he wrote a novel. And his novel, which is kind of illustrating his philosophical ideas, is called Nausea. And in his novel, the main character will every so often he's going through life and suddenly he just finds everything, he's disgusted by things. He's filled with nausea as though he's going to throw up or vomit. And this is another way in a contemporary novel, it's describing boredom, but here focusing on this aspect of disgust, of you just had enough. You don't, if something's boring you, you could get to the point where you're just disgusted by it. Just like, you could be eating something you really like, but you eat too much of it. And after a while, you're like, oh, you push it away. You've had enough. So now we've talked about just kind of what goes hand in hand with boredom, but then there's also the issue of different kinds of boredom and what we can see with times in which people experience boredom. And I think we have to make a big distinction between mild or temporary boredom. Like you're playing a game and you find it boring. That's mild boredom. But boredom can also be severe. I mean, in a lot of literature or other artistic forms, boredom is talked about not just as like, oh, this is, I have a headache and, it's too bad I have a headache. Where boredom is something, it's like somebody's whole life is challenged because they're so deeply bored and they don't have anything they want to do with their lives. Or an example of how painful boredom can be in these extreme cases is prisons. prisons typically reserve solitary confinement for the worst offenses. And why do they do it? Because being by yourself in a tiny little cell is very boring. That's the main punishment. And just to think about that, reflect on, wow, so that so many prisons, the severe punishment is you have to be by yourself with nothing to do. You're bored. So this is to say that, yes, we often, when we talk about boredom, it's something minor, but actually boredom can be severe. It can be quite serious. And it's striking how much at least in the Western media, sometimes very kind of extreme behavior, criminal behavior, risky behavior, gambling, addictive behavior can be linked to boredom as something that people are doing to try to get out of boredom. But without going into all these different kinds of boredom, one thing that's striking part of the phenomenon is that whenever we're bored, it's like immediately we want to escape from it. As soon as you realize, I find this movie boring, you start to think, okay, can I just leave? Maybe I'm with people. Can I just leave? Or would that be too rude? We start to think, how can I get out of this situation? And then when we can't escape it, we just become very weary and tired and disappointed. Okay, so I've just talked to a sketch to try to put into words boredom and our experience of it, and how it manifests itself. Actually, one thing I was just about, perhaps you will be the judge of whether this is a good example, but just this past week, I was reading that in current Chinese culture, especially youth culture, there is an expression now, sang wenhua, if I pronounce that correct, sang wenhua, about a kind of a culture of cynicism, apathy, negativity that connotes a kind of restless boredom with life. That, if from what I understand about this Chinese cultural phenomenon, that is a great example of what boredom leads to, a kind of an attitude of cynicism, of dissatisfaction with life, and holding things at a distance. Okay, so this far we've been talking about what boredom is, but let's try to understand it. What can we do to understand what boredom is? And as our first starting point, I'm going to talk about a medieval philosopher. And the reason why I'm going to talk about him is, first of all, I think he's got some great insights on emotion, which are very helpful for thinking about boredom, but also because he happens to be someone who I have great expertise on in my own research and writing. So Thomas Aquinas, he lives in the 1200s in Europe. He was from Italy. He's a Catholic priest, and he spent much of his life also in France and Italy, a little bit of time in Germany. Those are the main places he was. And he's widely regarded as one of the greatest philosophers of the Middle Ages. And he's got one masterpiece, a very long work, which he never finished. He died before he could finish it, called the Summa Theologiae, Latin title, meaning a compendium of theology. And in this very long work, he has a lengthy treatise on the passions. Passion is a rough synonym for emotion. And when he wrote it, it was the longest treatment of emotions ever written in Western history up to that point. And I myself have written a book on his thought on the emotions, and the information is there. And in fact, my work on Aquinas and emotion is the reason why I started visiting Chinese universities many years ago. It's because some of you might perhaps know my friend, Professor Wu Tianyue, who teaches at Peking University. We met many years ago, over 10 years ago, because somebody knew both of us, and we were both working on Thomas Aquinas on emotion. Anyway, so a little background of why to bring him up. He's a very historically significant figure who did groundbreaking work on emotion, and somebody I know very well. And so therefore I've had reason to see that what his thoughts on emotion are very relevant and helpful for thinking about boredom. Okay, so in Aquinas, he makes a big distinction between two kinds of emotion. Now, actually, first of all, I should say emotion in English and in many other European languages, like in French, there's émotion, and other European languages have similar words related to emotion. This word, as it is used today, is only 200 years old. Before 200 years ago, Western languages tended to use other words to talk about what today we call emotions. They actually had a variety of different words to describe different experiences, psychological experiences. So they had a kind of a wider vocabulary. You know, it's just like it said that people who live in places where there's lots of snow, they have many different words for different kinds of snow, where here in the United States, we just have one word, snow, because, you know, we don't experience a lot of snow. Well, likewise, it's a neat feature of a lot of Western philosophy and language that there are many words for different emotions, we call them today, and that make important distinctions. And Aquinas is like that. He has two different categories, divisions for emotion, and they're passions and intellectual affections. Passions always involve our bodies. Our bodies are somehow always connected with passions, and we share them in common with animals. We get angry, dogs get angry. When we get angry, things happen. Our hearts beat faster, things like that. And the passions ultimately trace back to our physical desires, pleasure, pain, very basic human experiences. Examples are anger, fear, some kinds of desire, love, aversion, hate, daring, you know, energy, courage. Those are kinds of examples of passions. On the other hand, intellectual affections are purely mental emotions. According to Aquinas, we share these intellectual affections. They're not just a human experience, but they're also things held in common with God, angels, spiritual beings. Intellectual affections can affect the body. They can also affect the passions, but they do not directly involve the body, and they are different from the passions. And so examples of intellectual affections would be our deepest desires, our deepest joys, but also our deepest sorrows and our deepest despair. A way to kind of get a handle on what an affection is versus a passion, it's very helpful to compare humans to animals. So, you know, we've got different kinds of good feelings. We and we in English, we often distinguish between pleasure and joy. Pleasure is kind of a generic word. It's like a good feeling, but it could be many different things. Joy, on the other hand, is like a very deep feeling. It's a positive feeling, a very deep feeling that somehow is more desirable. If generally, if you go to somebody and say, would you rather have pleasure or joy? People say, give me joy. Now, so a helpful way to make this distinction is to think about a dog. You could think about a dog being happy, a dog experiencing some kind of pleasure, but you can't really think about a dog having joy. Humans have joy, dogs don't have joy. So for Aquinas, joy is an intellectual affection. Pleasure is a passion. So that's the basic idea of this distinction. Oop. So, Aquinas is not the only philosopher to think in these terms. In fact, many contemporary philosophers have arrived at very similar conclusions. Just as a side note, many contemporary philosophy of emotion traces back to a recovery of Thomas Aquinas. In the 1960s, there were a lot of people working in philosophy and psychology who were reading Aquinas or were influenced by him. And one of the things that this gave rise to was a greater appreciation of how emotion responds to cognition, that what we feel responds to what we know. And famously, the most famous, perhaps, expression of this is a lot of cognitive psychology traces to this understanding of emotions in the 1960s, which was very influenced by Thomas Aquinas because of his emphasis on how what we feel responds to what we know. Now, so there are many contemporary philosophers of emotion who agree with Aquinas on that basic idea. And there are also many who agree with the idea that we do have emotions that shouldn't be thought of as bodily. Now, of course, we have bodies. So there's one sense in which, anything we feel is connected to our body in one way, because if we don't have a body, we're not there. But there is this growing sense that it's important to talk about emotions that are not bodily in the way other emotions are. Perhaps the most famous philosopher who argues for this position is Martha Nussbaum, who's at the University of Chicago. And she argues for this kind of understanding of emotion. Now, going back to Aquinas, when Aquinas thinks about intellectual affections, the way he defines them is he says they are movements of the will. That is, they are movements of a faculty, a power in the human person that's called the will. Now, this is a common idea in philosophy to think about that we have wills. Some people say, well, it's an illusion. Like, for example, some people say, we don't really have free will. It's an illusion. But everybody kind of knows what you're talking about, this will, this power that humans have to make choices. Now, today, often the will, this power to make choices, is thought of as a very simple power. Like you choose yes or you choose no. You choose chocolate ice cream or you choose vanilla ice cream. It's a power to make choices. That's it. That in a lot of contemporary philosophy, that is what the will is. But for Aquinas and for Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher, the will is much more than just a power to say yes or no. It is at its root an infinite desire for whatever appears good to our minds. In other words, the will is first and foremost not so much a power, but a fact that we desire, that as humans, we've got an infinite desire. Dogs, for example, don't have infinite desire. Dogs, they want food, they want comfort, they want warmth, they want shelter, but they don't have dreams. Dogs don't dream, boy, I wish I could be king of the dogs or something like that. They don't have infinite desires, whereas we have infinite desires. We can think of anything and we can desire it. We've got this infinite openness. And so for Aquinas and Aristotle, the will is this infinite desire, this infinite openness. But when in this world, we only deal with finite goods. We can somehow connect to infinite goods, but for the most part, what we have in front of us is finite. We have finite minds, and yet we've got these infinite desires. And so as a result of having to make choices, we have to kind of choose where to direct this infinite desire. And so for Aquinas and Aristotle, yes, we choose yes or no, we choose chocolate or vanilla, but that's kind of just like the tip of the iceberg. It's what happens when when we direct this infinite desire for what is good, for what we find attractive, and we kind of focus it on particular things. So that for Aquinas is what the will is. And when our will moves, when we go from just kind of generically having this infinite desire and say, no, I direct my will towards this, I direct it towards the chocolate ice cream, that's a movement of the will. And that's an intellectual affection. And according to Aquinas, when our will moves towards a good, but it doesn't actually get there, like you decide, I want chocolate ice cream, but you don't have it yet. That's desire. Aquinas calls that movement of the will desire. But you've decided you want chocolate ice cream and you have it. Well, now if your will rests in it, it can be joy. It goes beyond pleasure if your will delights in it. So that's a little bit of the basic idea of what Aquinas thinks about intellectual affections. Now, this then allows us to analyze boredom. Well, way to look at boredom is this. If you agree with Aquinas that we have this infinite desire, that we're constantly looking for things to direct it towards, well, what's going to happen if you have this infinite desire, but there's nothing that you see you find desirable and that's worthy of these infinite desires? You're like, yeah, vanilla ice cream, but I want more than that. Or and you have nothing you desire, you have nothing that you take joy in. Well, it's like your will is stuck. It doesn't desire and it doesn't have joy in anything. It's bored. It's stuck. It wishes it could go somewhere. The will is this desire for things, for objects. It's desire for the good. But when you're bored, it's like your will has nowhere to go. And this also then helps to explain why boredom in the will is going to lead to disgust and physical weariness. Because for Aquinas, what happens in your intellectual affections is going to move into your passions. They're different, but they're connected. And so even though this is something at a very kind of high level, it's going to affect our more basic passions. So here's a way to sum this up. Boredom is what happens when the will cannot find anything that satisfies its infinite desires. Or not just satisfies, nothing that is worthy of the infinite desires. Because, you know, if you have something you want, even if you don't have it yet, you're not bored because your will has something it's willing to strive for. So as a result, when we're bored, the will has nothing to desire and nothing to rejoice in. But the will can't stop desiring. It can't stop wanting something to desire. This is where Tolstoy's definition, I think, it's such a brilliant definition. It's the desire for desires. Your will can't help desire, but it doesn't necessarily have anything that it really can set itself on in terms of desire. It's like, I think of boredom, it's like a car stuck in mud. You know, you're in the car is stuck in mud, you press the accelerator, you press the gas pedal, the wheels are going to spin, but you're not going to go anywhere. That's what's happening when you're bored. And another way to think about boredom is to compare it with loneliness. If loneliness is what happens when we do not feel loved, boredom is what happens when we have nothing to love. It's a problem that comes up when there's nothing that we love. We want to love, we want to desire, but there's nothing there that grabs us. Now, another interesting perspective on boredom is the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer has a very similar understanding of boredom as Aquinas. Well, Schopenhauer actually talks about boredom. Thomas Aquinas does not. And he has a very similar analysis of boredom to the one I just gave you, using what Aquinas thinks about emotion to understand boredom. Now, it's striking how similar their views are on boredom, because they have such different views of the world. Schopenhauer, a German philosopher, was an atheist. Aquinas was a Catholic Christian. But they have very similar ideas about what the will is, and also about what boredom can be understood as. The big difference is that Aquinas thinks it is possible for our wills to find satisfaction, because he believes there is an infinite good. There is infinite good that our wills can connect to. But Schopenhauer, on the other hand, thinks that no, actually, we're doomed to be bored, because there's nothing that can satisfy our wills. And so life for Schopenhauer is all about going between desire and then getting what you desire, and then finding, I no longer am interested in this. I'm bored. And then you try to find something else to distract yourself, something else that interests you. You get it, and then you're bored again. And then each time you get more and more bored, because it takes more and more excitement to get your interest. It's like what happens in Against the Grain, in that novel I talked about at the beginning, that for that French nobleman, he just has to keep trying to do all different kinds of things, because everything eventually leaves him feeling bored. It can get him interested for a little bit, but eventually he gets bored. So one of the interesting things that this also helps to explain is an interesting phenomenon of boredom, which is that boredom is compatible with pleasure, but not joy. Very interesting. That you can imagine, like, for example, you could imagine having a fantastic meal. It's just, it's a wonderful meal, a great restaurant, but somehow you're still bored. It's like you recognize this is great, but you're also kind of empty. But that experience is not possible with joy. Whatever you want to call it, I said in English, people often distinguish between pleasure and joy, but whatever you want to call the better kind of good feeling, whatever it is, it's not something you can feel and be bored with at the same time. And this is connected to our wills are either desiring, or they have joy in something, or they're stuck. They don't desire and they don't have joy. And when they're stuck, we're bored. Okay. So now I want to speak a little bit about the origins of boredom, and particularly the question of, is boredom something that is particular to modern culture? This is something that's often said by many contemporary philosophers, literary figures, is that boredom is something that happens with modern life. So there's a great book on the philosophy of boredom written about 15 years ago by, I think he's Norwegian. He's Norwegian or Swedish philosopher. And it's a great book. I don't agree with anything in it, but it's a great book on boredom. And he's got this one line, and he represents this perspective. He says, boredom is the privilege of modern man. While there are reasons for believing that joy and anger have remained fairly constant throughout history, the amount of boredom seems to have increased dramatically. The world has apparently become more boring. Very interesting. To what extent might this be true? Is this true? Does it need some clarification, some nuance? It's certainly the case that now you have a lot more people talking about boredom. You've got all these novels, all these movies where boredom is a major theme. 200 years ago, there were no books like this, but now it's a big theme. What's happened? Well, first of all, the word boredom in English only goes back to the 1800s. It was a word that Charles Dickens, the famous English novelist, made up in his novel Bleak House. A little bit before that, in the early 1800s, people started to talk about boring. So in the sense of boring other people. Like, my professor bored me. I found his class very boring. But although the word boredom in English is relatively recent, English had already been using a French word. It had been borrowing a French word, ennui, to describe something similar. Ennui is a French word which is often translated as boredom, and it comes from an old French word, ennui, which means to annoy, to like bother, annoy. And that in turn comes from a Latin expression, mihi in odio est, it is hateful to me. The Italian word noia, the word for boredom, derives from the same Latin phrase. An interesting side note that illustrates this, culturally, the significance of this word. During the Italian Renaissance, there was one particular Italian noble family that named one of their summer villas the Palazzo Schifanoia, literally the palace of escape from boredom. So, in other words, even if boredom is a relatively recent word in English, this goes back to the Renaissance and even the Middle Ages. People are talking about something similar, but it goes back even further. There are three Greek and Latin words that we find in ancient culture and early medieval culture to describe something very similar. First, there's melancholia. Melancholia is kind of a complicated word. It can mean boredom. It can also mean depression, sadness. And but it's often used to describe things that we would often call boredom today. It's often used to describe sadness or depression, but so boredom is talked about there too. Then there's acedia, which is a vice or temptation which involves restlessness or sadness, and about doing what is good because of the effort involved. So it's a vice, it's a moral vice, and it has to do with just not having the energy to do the work that being good or virtue would require. And lastly, there's tedium, which is about an experience of boredom. It's something that's often brought on by doing the same thing again and again. So here are some examples of earlier mentions of these words. So this is from the 400s. This is describing, it's a book about Christian monks. And here's the quote: acedia makes a monk horrified at where he is, disgusted with his room, and also disdainful and contemptuous of the brothers who live with him. Likewise, it makes him lazy and weary in the face of all the work to be done within the walls of his dwelling. I'm gonna skip that. This is I like this one. This is a memorial that people found. Archaeologists found this in this town of Benvenuta in Italy, and they just find this memorial, a stone tablet with this carved into it. Fratertonius Marcellinus, a most distinguished man of the consular rank in Campania, and a most worthy patron as well, because of the good deeds by which he rescued the population from endless tedium. The entire people judges this inscription should be recorded. What this means is that people were so appreciative that he provided entertainment, games, festivals to help them not to be bored, that they left a stone tablet in his honor because he helped them not to be bored. Okay, so this is all to say that boredom is not new. All the historical evidence shows that it's not a modern concept. It's something that people have used different words to talk about for centuries, going back at least 2,000 years. And given the universality of the human condition, it's fair to say that this is a universal human experience. But it does seem that something has changed. It does seem that more and more people are feeling bored more and more of the time. And the biggest indicator of it is that people are talking about it more. And this suggests that boredom has been increasing and evolving. Why? Well, here's a theory. It seems to me that one of the downsides of material prosperity that we have because of science and technology is that it can naturally lead us to focus on material progress at the expense of social and cultural well-being and social and cultural goods. And if we focus too much on material goods, which by definition are finite and cannot satisfy the infinite desires of our will, we're going to end up on board. It's like if you focus on things that are interesting and attractive, but they're finite, you're going to get bored of them because only thing that's going to satisfy us are infinite things. And also when we focus on material prosperity, it can lead us, which is a good thing, of course, it can lead us to not to focus enough on what makes it possible to enjoy that prosperity. Things like family, friends, community, a sense of belonging. Because if we're focusing on material things, we're not giving our time and energy to those other things. So I'm sorry, I'm going to skip through a few things. So first, I just want to start off that boredom, I've been, mostly been kind of just speaking in general, but to say boredom can be a serious problem. So I mentioned that Scandinavian philosopher who wrote that book on philosophy of boredom. In the introduction, he says that the reason why he started to write about the philosophy of boredom is because he calls it the boredom-related death of a close friend. He doesn't explain what he means. It might be that his friend committed suicide. It might be that because he was doing something risky, to escape boredom and, fell off a cliff. It's not clear. But he wrote the book and he says, listen, I'm writing about the philosophy of boredom because this is not just a minor issue. It's a serious issue that affects quality of life and that it can be a life and death issue. The famous French poet Charles Baudelaire is he's got some wonderful poems. At one point, he's listing different vices, and he describes boredom, or in French, ennui, as the vice that is the most ugly, the most vicious, the most foul. Then he describes it as the delicate monster who wants to swallow the world with its yawn. So boredom can be serious, but what's the solution? So I don't want to just talk about problems today. So here are some solutions, some possible solutions. My best guess at ways to address this issue of boredom. I think the first solution is diagnosis. The sheer diagnosis of the problem provides relief. One of the other professors at my university has a very serious health problem. And just last week, it was mysterious, strange symptoms, life-threatening. And last week, the doctors gave him a diagnosis and they finally know what it is. Fortunately, it seems like he'll be okay. It's a serious problem, but he'll be okay. But just knowing what the problem was a huge relief to him and his wife. So likewise, just knowing what boredom is and that it can be a serious issue is itself a relief. And I think that's one of the reasons why the novel Against the Grain, which I talked about at the beginning, why it was so popular. And so many people read it in Europe because people felt like, somehow my experience has been recognized. There's a name for what I'm experiencing. And there's a great line from Walker Percy, the American novelist. He says, there's a great deal of difference between an alienated commuter riding a train to work and this same commuter reading a book about an alienated commuter riding a train. In other words, once we see that what our experience is, and we see somebody else talking about it, then suddenly we have perspective. There's a kind of relief that comes from it. So that's the first thing, simply diagnosis. But then the next thing is there any lasting solution to the problem of boredom? Well, people take different views here. According to Arthur Schopenhauer, German philosopher who wrote a lot about boredom, the answer is no. All that we can hope for is to be distracted from boredom. That, that we can expect that maybe from time to time, we will find different distractions that make us forget about things. We take pleasure, our desires are awakened, but ultimately we're going to end up still bored. Lars Svensson, the Scandinavian philosopher, also says no. He thinks that we should just accept boredom as part of modern life. Just accept it and just work around it. But according to Thomas Aquinas, and according to me, I think there are solutions that are possible. And here are some particular ones. They're very general solutions, but they would take some work to kind of elaborate more, but just in a limited time, just to say a few things. The first is simply to spend more time thinking about non-material spiritual goods, things that go beyond things that are finite. Remember, for so many contemporary philosophers, there's the recognition that emotion, what we feel, responds to what we know and what we think. And so by thinking about goods, infinite goods that go beyond the material. When I say infinite goods, I mean lots of different things: beauty, friendship, all kinds of different transcendent things. By thinking about them, because they are goods, they will attract us. And by attracting us, they will give us things that we desire. They will give us things that we want to do. And in this way, they will prompt desire, prompt action, and lead to things that will chase out boredom. Because as soon as we start to desire things, we're not bored. As soon as we have things that our will can say, yes, I want that, I want to do that, boredom is no longer a problem. And so if we think beyond material finite things, then that now it doesn't mean that to think beyond material finite things mean you ignore them. I mean things like, for example, if you're an artist, focus on the good of making something new. So this leads to the next thing, that a related thing to this cognition part is, I think, the importance of beauty. That beauty is something that awakens desire. When we experience something beautiful, beautiful art, beautiful music, a beautiful person, a beautiful character in someone, a beautiful heroic action that we read about, somebody does something truly good. This is beautiful, and it awakens in us desire for something more. And this then, again, as soon as we got desire, problem solved. Dostoevsky, the Russian novelist, has the famous line, "Beauty will save the world." And it's a very poetic line, and it could be just taken as poetry. But I think there's also actually a truth to this, insofar as beauty awakens in us desire for what is good. And once that desire is awakened, we do all kinds of things that we would not have done otherwise if beauty had not prompted us to do something more. So yes, this is just a slide about that. And the other thing about beauty is that beauty doesn't just awaken desire, it also gives us an experience of rest, an experience of joy, which again, if you have joy, no boredom. You have desire, joy, you're not going to be bored. And in this way, beauty, by giving us joy, recharges us, gives us new energy, and then, gives us energy to set our wills on worthy goods to desire. Another solution is, so I've been focusing on cognitive solutions, things about thinking or, observing beauty, but then proactive love. Because although cognition can awaken desires, what ultimately chases out boredom and is the will has to move. You have to use your will to do something. Cognition and thinking about things can make our wills desire something, but we still have to then do something with our desires. And proactive love is a way to do that. Now, I'm using love in a somewhat generic way. It could be, a scholar could have love for knowledge and the love of trying to communicate that knowledge to others. That's a proactive love. But whatever it is, it's something where it's not just a feeling, it's not just, oh, I feel love, it's an action of love for an activity, for a person, um, for whatever. For Thomas Aquinas, the two preeminent ways in which our wills are directed towards the infinite is by loving God and by loving other human beings, because human beings are infinite in a sense, because according to Aquinas, they are created in the image and likeness of God. They somehow resemble God's infiniteness, even though humans are of themselves finite. And I think the greatest example and most natural one is simply proactive human love. Friendship and human love are the most intrinsically interesting object toward which we can direct our wills, and therefore provides the best way out of boredom. But again, I'm not speaking about a feeling. I'm speaking about willing the good of other people, doing good things for other people, and recognizing in other people infinite good. And what kind of way to really kind of join things is love for other people connected to creative action. There's something about creativity, like if when you create something, that is a way that we can set our wills on developing something new, and it's especially attractive to our wills. Now, I will say, but this, having said this, I do need to address that, well, this just seems like a lot of work, this solution. It's easy to say proactive love of other people or proactive love of, knowledge and scholarship. It's easy to say that those things, are a solution to boredom, but these things require work, especially when, love isn't just a feeling, but you're willing good for other people. That takes work. It takes effort. And there's a great line. Another great work about boredom is Anton Chekhov, the Russian playwright. He has a play, Uncle Vanya. And in many respects, this play is about boredom. And at one point, one of the main characters, Yelena, she's a rich woman with a big estate. And she complains at one point that she's bored to death. She's so bored, she's close to death. And so her stepdaughter says, well, why don't you devote yourself to helping the farmers on your lands? But Yelena says, no, it's only in uplifting novels that people go out and help the farmers. You can kind of understand Yelena. She's like, I'm bored. You're just giving me work to do. I don't need work. I want something that's going to entertain me. But while I think it's important to recognize, yes, that makes sense that Yelena would feel that way. But in the end, that I think might be an important element of finding a solution to boredom that lasts. That the reality is, I think, that not being bored takes effort, in the sense that it's not going to be something that happens automatically. And so it makes sense that just like love requires effort, so too boredom, getting out of boredom, is going to require effort. I mean, if not being bored were easy, there would be a lot fewer bored people in the world. But, as a lot of contemporary culture shows, boredom is a major issue. And there's Yelena's perspective also is a kind of trap. Yelena's like, what she meant in that is, I want a distraction. I want, maybe somebody can perform for me, do a play, or we can play a game. That's what she meant. That's what she was looking for. But the thing is, those kind of things don't satisfy us in a deep, enduring way. Those are the kinds of things that you eventually get bored of because they're finite. It goes back to Schopenhauer's analysis. You could find it enjoyable for a while, but eventually you're going to get bored of it. But when the will is directed towards things of infinite transcendent value, other humans, important, objectives, beauty, justice, all these kind of things. Those are the kinds of things that are infinite in a sense, and that we can then, do and not be bored. And I'm just going to mention one last thing briefly, and then I'll finish the lecture and very happy to hear your questions. And the last thing I think is a cultural tradition in the West, which is somewhat challenged now. And that is having a regular weekly communal time for rest, contemplation, and building community. In the Jewish and Christian traditions, there is an understanding that people should rest one day per week and give that day to spiritual and social activities, to do no work, but just spend the day in other activities. And Western society used to stop on Sundays. People would dress up, families would celebrate with a large meal and a picnic. People would go visit friends in their homes. People would go outside. And this kind of communal pause, where there's a sense of nobody should be working, some people might have to work, but the idea that as many people as possible don't work and just enjoy the day, enjoy the world, enjoy each other. Do things like make special meals. It's striking how much the great cultural traditions, the great culinary traditions of different cultures are associated with holidays when people aren't working and people develop all kinds of special foods to eat on those days. These kind of things provide an opportunity for people to step back and not be so focused on, finite things, but on what is more transcendent and more enduring, that goes beyond the material: friendship, community, other spiritual values. And also, one of the things that this did was it also built community. And when people feel they're a part of a community, when they feel that they're part of something bigger than themselves, that in itself helps people face boredom and to not be trapped by it. Okay, well, thank you very much for your intention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Nicholas.
Okay.
Yes.
My pleasure.
I'm going to thank you for a wonderful and interesting lecture. And I think I actually didn't pay attention to this phenomena before I read your paper. And then immediately I realized that actually it is there, and we just take it for granted. We just overlook it, and we didn't think that it's a serious problem actually. And I'm going to share my screen, and I also did a very short response.
Okay.
God. So everybody can see this, right? Good. Actually, Professor Lombardo has shared with us a lot of information today. So he talked about what is boredom and why we're bored, and how boredom evolved and developed in the history, and why we're more and more easier to get bored in modern times, and how our ancestors described boredom, and in the end, it's very positive and a very good way that offered some solutions, very good suggestions to deal with the boredom. And you have told us that it is possible that we do not have to avoid the boredom, but accept it and recognize it, then takes some energy and efforts to deal with it, to live with it. And actually, while reading your paper and think of this topic about the boredom, I thought of this intellectuals in our Chinese history. These are the intellectuals at Wei and Jing dynasties. That's about the third century. Yeah, it's a time very chaotic. The changes of dynasties are so many and so often. People are always in the war, and the political situation is not good. And these intellectuals are famous because, and for their a lot of absurd actions and behaviors, so that they're quite famous in history, and we recall them a lot. The reason I recall, I connect them with this boredom or 无聊, sometimes people describe them using the word boredom. They think that why they, you see from the picture, you can see that they drink a lot, and also they took drugs to get rid of the boredom. Seems that they are getting rid of the boredom. Actually, what they're bored is the political situation. They were, they can't say much. If they say, then they are going to be killed. And they have been trained and educated, and they want to do something for the country and for the people, for the society, but they can't. So it's a way of living that they have to find a way. So that's related to boredom, so that's an interesting thing to think about that. And also, as you said, the Chinese word for boredom is 无聊. And also another word is for 厌烦. Actually, you can find 无聊 a lot. For the 无聊, you can see that there's some definitions about this word, but the Chinese words are actually, the characters, the compounds, they put them together to make a new meaning. So each word has a meaning. Wu means without or nothing, and no. And liao means something to rely on. So wu liao actually makes some new meanings. So at the beginning, originally, it's something that you do not have any life resources to rely on. So this poor. And then you have no spiritual resources to rely on, so you get bored. And then you feel that also you're useless. Life is meaningless. Then you get bored. So it's 无聊, the meaning of the 无聊. And also, as you have said, there is a 无聊文化, the culture of this 无聊, and also the 丧文化. It's quite popular in the past decades, and they're all related to this. And also the other word for this boredom is 厌烦. And also 厌, and also 厌 means you disgust, you do not like it. 烦 means you feel impatient, you get restless. So putting these two characters together, 厌烦, so it's very naturally leads to what you have described. This boredom leads to this sickness and fed up with, and this disgusting or nausea, all these kind of things. And also the poems that show has these two characters together is as early as in the 11th century in Chinese history. So it's quite early. So people are having these words or having been describing this kind of phenomena. And also reading your words and also doing some research, and then I read this interesting article written by Russell, The Boredom and Excitement, and I like these three. And I think he has many, some very good suggestions, because a lot of times, when we talk about the boredom, a certain amount of boredom actually will be creative, will help you, stimulate you to do something or to try to find a different way to get over it. So, and also he talked about we are less bored than our ancestors now, actually, as we are in the modern times, but we are more afraid of boredom than our ancestors. We try to escape, and we do not have that power. And also a certain power of enduring boredom is therefore essential to happy life, and is one of the things that ought to be taught to the young. That his criticism is to the parents, that because they always take their kids to all the excitement experiences, and they do not let them be trained to get rid of their boredom. So that's why in modern times they're less and less durable for boredom. So my questions, actually, you talked about Aquinas' intellectual affection and a passion, this theory, emotion, because what I'm interested is in this word. See, passion, I know it's physical, something, very strong feelings that our physical body can feel or can tell. And Then intellectual. So why is intellectual not mental? So, I mean, I just need your help to help me with the English, you know.
Right.
So why intellectual, not mental? And affection, we know that is a mild feeling. So it's deliberately, I chose this affection instead of other words. Maybe it's in contrast with passion, it's not that strong, but it's intellectually, or why not mental? And affection, why affection? So it's a mild. So intellectual affection, actually, for us Chinese, to think, you know, to try to find a good translation to, so that we can understand this better. Like passion, we can understand it, but intellectual affection, I need your help
Sure.
to grasp it, you know. So why this can be paired together and in this theory. So that's my first question. And the second question, you can ignore the second or the third. You talk about the solutions and they are all from the Christian traditions. So does that mean that Christians are free of having the challenge of boredom? I really doubt it. Yeah, but you also mentioned that the monks actually acedia, you know, afraid of that, and it's a big problem or a big challenge for them to get bored. And so for Christians, they're saying they have the same challenge, that how they have these resources, like what you have said, to love, or to love others and to love God, and also to do something for the others, and to rest according to God's will or commandment. But still, why they're still having this challenge of boredom, and why they still can't get rid of it. And also the third question, maybe it's not a question, but just a thing, because Russell also talk about this, you know, as he said, that boredom, a certain amount of boredom is helpful. And then, so it's also excitement, you know, these two opposite together, but a certain amount of excitement is also good. So everything is about this quantitative, you know, this amount. And that reminds me, you know, he said, you know, everything you have to, even the excitement, if it's not too much, it's not excessive, then it's good. And so that reminds me of this appropriateness, or this quantitative amount of our passion, or our feelings, our emotions. And that's the Chinese 中庸, you know, the nickname. And that's what the Chinese history or the Chinese ideas always try to stress, or the center or the central ideas of the Chinese philosophy. So that may be also the inner resources for Chinese. That's what I thought. Yeah. Thank you very much. So that's my comment.
Well, thank you very much for that. I found, especially, you know, when you trace through some of the aspects of Chinese history, to see how prevalent very similar ideas are
Yes.
in Chinese history and culture. That's very striking to me. So in terms of the question, so first question about intellectual affections and passions. So there, actually, my reason for using those particular words are because they stay very close to the Latin words that Aquinas happened to use. So it's not, there's no reason why, why that other words couldn't be used. And in fact, I can see now that you brought it up, how that could be kind of confusing, because it only really makes sense because I was staying very close to English words that were close to Latin words. But so how might I do, maybe, yeah, so you could say mental or intellectual, either is fine. Well, actually, if in English, if I were even, you know, outside of a more academic context, I avoid using either passion or affection, and I'll just use emotion in general. And you know, and maybe specify, you know, try to find some other way, you know, just in general, because you know, emotion is such a contested category among philosophers and psychologists. I try to avoid trying to define it too much, and just draw people's attention to, you know, we experience some things, some emotions that dogs don't experience. you know, and then kind of, and point people to observations like that. Another thing which I've found worth bringing up is in English, the word emotion doesn't always capture important things like the desire for truth, for example. And I say to people, desire for truth, is that an emotion? And people will say, I don't know. And I also would say, I don't know, because the English word emotion tends not to be used for desires like that. And yet, I think it should be a kind of emotion. But anyway, so this is, I'm getting a little off track, but the general point is when I in the passion and affection distinction, I think is not very useful, even in English, but only for very technical discussions based on medieval thought, for example. Now, I'm trying to remember the second question. Oh, about in Christian tradition. Yes. So, and actually, I saw one question,
Yes.
which relates to, so I mentioned about theologically, could Jesus get bored? So this, I think what the general, what the Christian tradition has to offer is first and foremost, well, many things, but first, a diagnosis that there is something in the Christian tradition which has recognized something like boredom. It calls it acedia. It calls it a vice. That reflect, you know, and especially it was people like monks in particular who are kind of living very simple lives, who are wrestling with this experience. Now, this aspect of the tradition is, it's somewhat of a weakness because it's framed only in terms of a vice. Whereas I think boredom is best understood as something broader than a vice, something inherently, I mean, I think boredom is negative, but it's not something like you have to say that it's like a vice, like greed, for example. So that's something the Christian tradition has, that's kind of like a mixed, you know, it's got a lot of reflection, which is useful and relevant, but it needs to be broadened beyond just thinking in terms of a vice as something against virtue. Now, so then what I would say, that you know, whether within a Christian tradition or another tradition, and this applies to that question about theologically, could Jesus get bored, is that someone who loves is not bored. And so the degree to which someone loves or doesn't love is going to determine whether they're bored or not their ideas, not their beliefs, but what they actually do. So, and in my own reflections, actually, a figure which I have thought a lot about in my reflecting on boredom is a famous Christian holy man who was known for living on top of a pillar for 30 years of his life. So a situation which, you know, and, you know, even in the Christian tradition, people are like, well, was this person psychologically healthy? You know, there's questions about that. But the point was, he was recognized in his lifetime as this holy individual who stayed up on top of a pillar and was apparently not bored. And this is like, and this is a thing about, I think, holy people in many traditions, Christian traditions, other traditions, Buddhist traditions, is that they often are doing things that seem very boring. And yet you meet them and you realize these people are not bored. And so, and I think that this is where I'd say what the biggest things the Christian tradition has to offer, or other traditions have to offer, are examples of figures who, living examples of people who do things that might seem boring for, like, you know, an ordinary person, and yet because they do them with love or some sense of purpose, some sense of desire, they're not bored. And then that points to something. So the question of Jesus theologically, could he get bored? Well, the answer would be, theologically, from a Christian perspective, no, because anyone who's loving can't be bored.
Yeah.
And then the Bertrand Russell, yeah. So I go on the question of to what extent is boredom a good thing, like in small doses, and there is a way in which, so I don't have a settled opinion on this. I've thought about this. On the one hand, it's true, like when you are, like when I am bored, like what it kind of forces you to be kind of creative and say, what can I do that is more interesting than what I'm doing now? And it can be a spur to new breakthroughs in thought. But and so that experience I think is definitely true. But the part that I'm not settled on is that really boredom? Like, when you're kind of that kind of creative impetus, is that really boredom? Or is that somebody straining against too narrow perspectives? So I don't. A similar thing that sometimes has been brought up is, well, because I'll say animals don't get bored, and so, well, people say, well, if you put like an animal in a cage, it might do things that seem like it's bored, like it might kind of crash into the bars and then kind of, lay in a heap or something, exhausted. But there, I wouldn't say the animal is bored. It's what happens when an an animal's natural tendencies to like go out and hunt have been thwarted, and they're kind of reacting to that. But that itself is a question that requires a lot of thought and precision. So anyway, so the question is, it's something to which I think there's a lot of truth to. Something like boredom can be a positive thing, but for me, I wonder, is it really boredom, or is it something similar to boredom that's that positive spur? Okay.
Okay. Several questions posted on the QA part.
Okay.
One of them is quite easy. Is the opposite of boredom joy? You can give a quick answer.
Yeah, so I would say there is that, I wouldn't say joy. If you have joy, you can't be bored. But I think of boredom as somewhere in between joy and desire. So it's like in between joy and desire. So in one sense, it's an opposite to a joy, but in another sense, it's just in the middle between joy and desire.
The next question is a bit long. You describe boredom as stuck, which leads to disgust. I wonder if boredom can be understood as taking away from one thing and moving towards something new. Maybe we haven't found anything new yet, but we have shifted our attention. People will not be trapped by instinctive desires, just like Scheller said, and then open to the world. A little bit similar to that, is boredom a little bit good or something like that?
Yeah. So here, to answer this question, I kind of take a more of kind of like a story. It goes back to that novel, Against the Grain. Now, part of the context of that novel is that, the nobleman who it's about, before he kind of does this experiment to go live by himself and do all these things like playing with perfumes and flowers and color decoration, he's lived a life seeking all kinds of hedonistic pleasure. He's kind of tried all kinds of things. And he's tried one thing, then he got bored of it. He tried another. And the point in this is that there is a certain way in which he's tried a lot of things, and it's just, he moved from something that was interesting, but then it became boring again. And then it became, and then he tried something else. But as things went on in his life in the novel, it took more and more and more so that he would not be bored. Like he'd have to have more, something different, something new. Like it just kept getting harder and harder for him to avoid being bored. So as I see your question here, yes, it's true that when we're bored, it can be a moment when we're like, okay, now it's time for me to get some, to try something even more exciting, even more distracting. And that kind of approach, from what I've come to conclude, is that will simply eventually lead to more boredom. Like whereas instead though, the positive moments to say, okay, none of this is satisfying. I'm bored with what I'm doing now. I want something else. And the positive movement would be then to say, let me set my will on something that is more than just a finite good. Yes, it's going to require effort. Yes, it's going to require, something else, but it will be something that my will can truly desire and my will can truly rejoice in, not just for a moment, but for a long period of time. So,
I think his question is on the word stuck.
yes.
Maybe we can put it that way, if I understand you right, is that actually boredom is stuck in a kind of desire that's trying to find something to satisfy your desire. You're stuck there. So, because you're stuck in your desire to try to find something that can get away from this boredom, so you shift your attention to all the things and try, but you're still stuck there.
Yes. So that in that moment of being stuck, before you kind of set out on anything new, you're experiencing your will, all this infant desire. It's got nowhere to go. And so
Yes.
if you don't get out of that stuckness,
Yes.
you're going to feel disgust, you're going to feel weariness, you're
Yeah.
going to feel apathy. But then there are two possible options to move from that stuckness. And first of all, you might just maybe nothing occurs to you. You're just stuck and and you see no way out. Like you're in a cell in a prison in solitary confinement and you just feel like there's no way out. But one route is you try some distraction. The other route is that you look at something that's going to be more infinite and hopefully satisfying. So I think I'll stop there. I hope that helped.
Okay. Yeah, we move on to the next one. Interesting question. How could we know that dog or other species can't get bored?
So this is a good question. So as I
Yes,
mentioned, this
I'm
is sometimes
interested in that too.
comes up. And one thing we have a difficulty with in answering this question is we can't talk to dogs and hear from them because so much of the experience of boredom is something internal. And it is by definition, it's something that is a subtle thing to even describe. So we have a problem, and I think the caged animal is the test case, because I think so. Let me start over. That all we have so we have this big difficulty. We can't talk to dogs, so we can only look at their behavior and try to figure out, do we see something like human experience of boredom? And this is debatable, but I would say in most ordinary situations, you're not going to find anything in dog behavior that looks like boredom. As Walker Percy says, in the kind of situations in which humans, generally get bored, a dog just goes to sleep. Now, where I do think you've got a challenging issue is what happens when you have a caged animal. Because caged animals will behave in very different ways. And somebody could argue, well, what they're showing is boredom. And so that's a legitimate argument. I'd be inclined to say, no, we're seeing something else. We're seeing animals have all of these instinctual drives, and these instinctual drives are somehow going haywire because they can't express themselves. But it's not boredom. But I will admit that a lot of this, my conclusion is partly based on observation, but partly based on my judgment that humans and animals are different in a categorical way because of the absence of any apparent indications of rationality in animals.
So is it possible that we talk about boredom without mentioning or comparing ourselves to animals? Why is it still necessary that we always drag dogs into our discussion about boredom?
The reason why I myself end up bringing in dogs and animals in general is because I find it a very helpful test case to say, okay, however we want to define it, we generally agree that animals and humans, on the one hand, have a lot in common in our psychological experience of the world, and yet there's also a big gap. And so I find it helpful to bring in animals as a way of trying to isolate what is special to being human. But it is a fraught thing because we can't talk to dogs. So, we're basing a lot of, we're forced to jump to make a lot of conclusions based on observations of behavior, which, unlike with humans, we can talk to humans.
Mm-hmm. Next question also. As you mentioned, Uncle Vanya, the mentioned reaction of Yelena to Sonia's advice, it reveals me that danger of boredom descending into indifference, especially moral indifference to the weak, the oppressed, the body in pain. Can intellectual emotion without animality, affection, or embodiment avoid the danger of omitting embodied pain of the other just before and around us? Would you like to talk more about how literature can contribute to understanding rather than overcoming boredom in modern culture? Can you just answer the first question? We can leave the second one.
So intellectual emotion can, of itself, could either be attentive to the suffering and pain of others,
Mm-hmm.
or it could avoid it, or even delight in it. You see, that's one of the things that that we, sadly, it's true that we humans can take malicious delight in the sufferings of others.
Mm-hmm.
There are serial killers who kill people because they enjoy killing people and
Mm-hmm.
watching them, suffer.
Yes.
So, and that happens at the level of the will. That's an intellectual emotion. So intellectual emotion can be directed towards what is good, or to something that might appear good to someone, but ultimately is not.
Mm-hmm. Good. Next question will be, how is boredom different? How is boredom different from depression? Someone caught by depression may feel no desire for anything. In this regard, I think they are pretty similar. And you also mentioned some precedents of the word boredom that contain the sense of depression. Yes, good question.
So you're right. The boredom and depression, there are a lot of similarities, and historically, melancholia was used to talk about things that overlap with them. So one thing about depression. So say there are many things about depression that would not be, we can, I think, kind of isolate out, like feelings of sadness, those kind of things. We can say, okay, that's specific to depression. When it comes to not wanting to do anything, that's the part maybe where it's closest to boredom. And maybe one thing that we can have as a test to distinguish between them is, what is the reason why someone does not want to do anything? Is it because there's an overwhelming sense of sadness that therefore drains energy? Or is it because the will is kind of not able to find anything? It's got energy to look for things, but it's not finding something. So that's might be one way to distinguish between them. But I wouldn't want to push that too far because they are very closely related. And I think it's one of the reasons I think another, only talked about very briefly, but I do think a related solution to boredom that's important to bring into it is that to some extent, boredom is a problem we can solve by ourselves, in the sense that, theoretically, according to this, my understanding of boredom, that if we have our will directed towards something that's an infinite good, we're going to feel desire, we will feel joy. It may take some effort, but will be satisfying in the long run. But, being able to do that is not something most people, or maybe anybody, can really do on their own. People need support. They need to feel that they belong, that they're loved, that people care about them. And these things give people energy to address the problem of boredom. So there is a way in which depression, loneliness, other kind of social depression is not purely a social thing, but it can be connected to social things. These things are part of the problem of boredom. And so I think a holistic approach to boredom can't just focus on what the individual does. It's also got to focus on relations with others and support that individuals can get from each other. And maybe one thing to develop, one of the reasons why I think why there might be more boredom in the modern world is because of ties in communities are not as strong as they used to be. People are more kind of on their own in the big modern world, without a sense of, you belong in this place. Yeah, maybe you're not respected that much in this place, but you belong. You might be not the most important person, but you have a sense you belong. You're part of something. Whereas now, because things are more anonymous, they're more technical, there's more room for people to feel isolated from each other. And then this also contributes to depression and boredom.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I think it is very helpful for the scholars like you to address the phenomena of boredom, especially in this pandemic time. And because, as you said, we are isolated and quarantined, it's much easier to feel the boredom, the presence of the boredom. And I think if we do not recognize it or cognitively realize that it is a problem and something that we need to pay attention to or take it seriously, then we are going to be very seriously get depressed. And maybe if you get depressed for a long time, then your body will be changed, and actually you do need doctor's help. Otherwise, it's truly, something like boredom, you still can get rid of that maybe by not seeing the doctor. You do not need to see the doctor to get rid of or to deal with the boredom. But when you're seriously sick or depressed, and that's something that you need the help of the doctor. So what we're talking today, what we're discussing or describing this phenomena actually is the scholar's duty or the work to contribute to address this issue and tell you that, there is a history. It's not something new, but it is more and more serious actually in today's time with our high technique. If we do not pay attention to it, or if we do not recognize it or think of a way. Yes, as you have said, we do all have to work together in a community so that we can deal with it in a proper way and to try the resources to help each other. And I think that's all the questions. We have answered everything. Yes, thank you so much. And I still have a work to announce for the announcement for the next guest professor, I think. Follow our WeChat official account. Yeah, please, all the audience can follow the WeChat official account, Hanyu CSCT, to obtain the thesis and watch Sino-Christian Theology online lecture series. And you can also visit the website, Logos and Pneuma Journal, because it's uploaded to the website for free. So in the past, it's quite difficult for us to find articles published in that journal. Now it's accessible. So you're welcome to visit the official website of the journal. And next lecture series will be What is Religious Experience? A historical overview from Kant to the present, given by Professor Jörg Loster, a professor from Ludwig Maximilian University, Munich. It's on June the 1st, 2021, in the afternoon, 4 p.m. A religious experience, also very interesting topic. Thank all of you very much, and thank you, Nicholas,
Thank you
for being with us and giving us this wonderful and interesting topic and the lecture. And thank our colleagues at ISCS for helping us with all these techniques and providing this platform for discussion and exchanges. And we hope that we will see you next time. And if you have any questions or feedbacks, you're welcome to send your messages to the colleagues in ISCS. Thank you, Nicholas.
Thank you.
Hope you have a good night and good sleep. Bye.
Bye. Good night.